Hello, welcome to today's training entitled Determining Eligibility for McKinney-Vento Rights and Services. I'm your presenter, Christina Dukes with Pearl Strategies. Thanks for joining. This training is offered by the Nebraska Department of Education's McKinney-Vento Homeless Education Program in partnership with Pearl Strategies and SchoolHouse Connection. Pearl Strategies is an educational consulting and technical assistance firm focused on the homeless education sector and its cross-system partners. SchoolHouse Connection is a national nonprofit organization working to overcome homelessness through education via strategic advocacy and practical assistance. Let's get started. Here's where we're headed today. Our focus will be on the McKinney-Vento Act and its definition of homeless, including breaking down key definitional phrases in more detail and identifying questions that can be asked to clarify whether a particular living arrangement might be considered homeless. This training focuses on the essentials of determining McKinney-Vento eligibility, but there are great resources available if you want to take a deeper dive. So before closing out, we'll identify resources you can access for more information. Feel free to pause the video at any time to process the information being shared or take a stretch break. Also, don't forget to download the training slides handout so you'll have access to the hyperlinks shared throughout. You also can download the slide deck to be customized for your use when providing your own training. Let's set the context for today's discussion by talking briefly about the McKinney-Vento Act. The McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act was originally passed into law in 1987 and represented the first significant federal legislative response to homelessness. The act authorizes assistance to people experiencing homelessness, including housing interventions and supportive services. In education circles, when referring to the McKinney-Vento Act, we're actually referring to Subtitle 7B of the Act, the Education subtitle, which was reauthorized by Title IX Part A of the Every Student Succeeds Act in 2015. It establishes the definition of homeless used by U.S. public schools and authorizes rights and services to address the unique educational barriers and challenges faced by students experiencing homelessness. To ensure its implementation, the Act requires state education departments to designate a state coordinator for homeless education who serves as the key homeless education contact at the department and oversees the Act's implementation in districts throughout the state. Likewise, school districts must designate a local homeless education liaison who serves as the key homeless education contact in the district and oversees the Act's implementation in schools throughout the district. Early in the text of the McKinney-Vento Act, we find what might be considered the Act's elevator pitch, or a quick summary of what it's about. It reads, state education departments and school districts must review and revise laws, regulations, practices, or policies that may act as a barrier to the identification of, or the enrollment, attendance, or success in school of children and youth experiencing homelessness. The McKinney-Vento Act defines homelessness as a child or youth who lacks a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence, including sharing the housing of other persons due to loss of housing, economic hardship, or a similar reason. This is commonly referred to as doubling up. Living in motels, hotels, trailer parks, or camping grounds due to the lack of alternative adequate accommodations. Living in emergency or transitional shelters, or abandoned in hospitals, living in a public or private place not designed for or ordinarily used as a regular sleeping accommodation, living in cars, parks, public spaces, abandoned buildings, substandard housing, bus or train stations, or similar settings, and migratory children living in the above circumstances. Because it is difficult for federal statute to anticipate every possible living arrangement that could be considered homeless, there may be other living arrangements that would be considered homeless because they are not fixed, regular, and adequate, but that are not listed specifically in the definition. Unaccompanied youth also are eligible for McKinney-Vento rights and services. The McKinney-Vento Act defines unaccompanied youth as a homeless child or youth not in the physical custody of a parent or guardian. For a student to be an unaccompanied homeless youth, two things must be true. The student must be, one, experiencing homelessness, meaning that their living arrangement meets the McKinney-Vento definition. And two, the student must be unaccompanied, meaning they are not under the care of a parent or guardian. A custody or guardianship issue alone is insufficient for a student to be considered an unaccompanied youth and therefore eligible for McKinney-Vento rights and services. In most states, including Nebraska, the majority of McKinney-Vento students are staying in doubled up arrangements. Why would that be? Well, let's consider why many youth or families losing housing would double up. When thinking of what it means to experience homelessness, many people think of homeless shelters. And while some people experiencing homelessness are staying in a shelter, this may not be an option for many youth or families for a variety of reasons. First, not every community has a shelter. Shelters often are concentrated in population centers like urban or suburban areas, leaving many communities without any kind of shelter safety net. This would certainly be relevant in a predominantly rural state like Nebraska. When shelters are present, they may be full or have stay limits. So if a family or youth is able to access shelter, they may only be able to stay there for a certain period of time, such as 30 or 60 days. Parents and youth also may have concerns about the shelter environment. Is it safe? Will I have any privacy? These concerns may be enough for a family or youth to avoid shelter altogether. Also, some shelters may have policies that create barriers, such as a curfew that conflicts with a parent's work schedule. The McKinney-Vento definition of homeless also mentions unsheltered locations and hotels or motels. Families and youth often avoid unsheltered locations such as cars or parks and may not have the money to stay in a hotel or motel. Because of this, doubled up arrangements often serve as temporary shelter, with the host family allowing the guest family or youth to stay in their home for a period of time because they have nowhere else to go. These arrangements, however, may be short-lived or even unsafe. We've done the broad brush sweep of the McKinney-Vento definition. Now let's get into the nitty-gritty, as some might say. Let's break down what is often referred to as the definition's guiding phrase, lacking a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. The statute itself doesn't define these terms further. The working definitions you see are compiled from legal dictionaries and state McKinney-Vento homeless education plans. Fixed is defined as stationary, permanent, and not subject to change. Regular is defined as used on a predictable, routine, and consistent basis. Adequate is defined as lawfully and reasonably sufficient for meeting the physical and psychological needs typically met in a home environment. Remember that you can always go back to the fixed, regular, and adequate guiding phrase in any consideration of McKinney-Vento eligibility. Given that the majority of McKinney-Vento students in Nebraska and across the country are doubling up, it's important to understand the nuances of this portion of the definition. So let's unpack that language more carefully. The legislative language for what is referred to as doubling up reads, sharing the housing of other persons due to loss of housing, economic hardship, or a similar reason. When thinking about sharing the housing of other persons, consider, does the family or youth have a legal right to be in the home? Can the family or youth be asked to leave at any time with no legal recourse? When thinking about due to loss of housing, consider if the family or youth lost housing due to an eviction or foreclosure, destruction of or damage to the previous home, unhealthy or unsafe conditions, domestic violence, abuse or neglect, for the absence of a parent or guardian due to abandonment, incarceration, or a similar reason. When thinking about economic hardship, consider whether limited financial resources forced the family or youth to leave their personal residence and share housing due to an inability to pay the rent or mortgage and other bills. For instance, did economic hardship due to an accident or illness, loss of employment, loss of public benefits, or a similar reason force the family or youth to share the housing of others temporarily? Here are additional clarifying questions to consider when thinking about whether a shared housing arrangement might be considered homeless. What circumstances led to the shared housing? A couple of examples. For instance, did the family ask to stay with the neighbor because mom lost her job, could no longer pay the rent, and so she and her son were evicted? Or did mom and her son move in with her parents to help care for an aging father? What is the intention of the people sharing housing? For instance, in the case of the evicted mom and her son, they may plan to move out as soon as mom can get a new job and has enough money for a new apartment. Whereas in the case of the mom and son moving in with the mom's parents, the mom and son may plan to stay for the long term to provide needed support. What are the families or youth's housing options if not sharing housing? The evicted mom and son may have nowhere else to stay and so might stay in their car if unable to stay with the neighbor. Whereas the mom caring for an aging parent may have remained in her home with her son if her help weren't needed with her father. And it's a good idea to consider if the shared housing arrangement is fixed, regular, and adequate. For instance, some doubled up arrangements may result in extreme overcrowding, or some doubled up arrangements may consist of a family staying in their neighbor's garage where there may be no heat despite a cold climate. Hopefully, breaking down the legislative wording of doubled up and walking through questions and consideration has given you tools to help you think through this more nuanced portion of the definition. Let's move on to another phrase included in the definition: living in motels, hotels, trailer parks, or camping grounds due to the lack of alternative adequate accommodations. Most families or youth staying in motels, hotels, or camping grounds are likely to be considered homeless, as these arrangements usually are not fixed, regular, and adequate. However, considering whether the family or youth may have access to an alternative adequate accommodation, meaning another safe and stable place to stay, can help identify possible exceptions. In contrast, most trailers would be considered fixed, regular, and adequate residences. However, asking questions about the adequacy of the trailer may help tease out possible exceptions. For instance, is the trailer in adequate condition? How many people are living in the trailer? Let's look now at the concept of substandard housing, which is closely related to the concept of adequacy. The statute itself does not define substandard housing, but in its homeless education program guidance, the U.S. Department of Education provides additional detail. The department acknowledges that standards for adequate housing may vary by locality and suggests that districts consider relevant city, county, and state housing codes. Further, the department recommends considering if the housing lacks a fundamental utility, such as water, electricity, or heat, if the housing is infested with vermin or mold, if the housing lacks a basic functional part, such as a working kitchen or toilet, if the housing presents unreasonable danger to people staying there, including to people with disabilities. It is important for school districts to establish guiding criteria on what is considered substandard and then apply those criteria consistently when making eligibility determinations. Let's summarize with a few other hints. Remember that the local liaison has the authority and responsibility to make determinations of McKinney-Vento eligibility, although this may be done in partnership with other trained school or district staff. Remember to pay close attention to the definition's legislative wording, since oftentimes the definition itself may provide the clarity we need to make a determination. Remember that eligibility determinations should be made on a case-by-case basis, considering the unique circumstances of each student. And finally, remember that some determinations will be clear and self-evident, while others may require a more nuanced application of the definition of homeless. Before we close out, a quick word on where to go for more information. Nebraska local liaisons and their education and community partners may want to visit the Nebraska Department of Education's Homeless Education Program webpage. There you'll find the contact information of the Nebraska State Coordinator for Homeless Education and other resources to help you in your work. Liaisons and partners also are encouraged to access support from the National Center for Homeless Education, the U.S. Department of Education's Federal Homeless Education Technical Assistance Center. An excellent related resource from NCHE is its Determining Eligibility Issue Brief. Read through the brief and keep it handy so that you can reference it as needed when making eligibility determinations. You also may want to contact NCHE's Homeless Education Helpline with questions by calling 800-308-2145 or emailing homeless@serve.org. Well, that's it. You have completed the Determining Eligibility training. Hopefully the information you learned today will be helpful for you in your work. And of course, feel free to reach out to the Nebraska Department of Education, Pearl Strategies, or SchoolHouse Connection should you have additional questions. Thanks for joining.